It is February 2nd, 2014, Super Bowl Sunday. 112 million Americans are watching the Seattle Seahawks destroy the Denver Broncos in what will become one of the most lopsided championship games in NFL history. But during a commercial break, something strange happens. A RadioShack commercial comes on, and it is somehow the most honest 30 seconds of advertising anyone has seen in years. The spot opens in a RadioShack store that looks frozen in time: wood paneling, fluorescent lights, a wall of products that could have been there since the Reagan administration. Two employees stand behind the counter in their red polo shirts, looking vaguely defeated. The phone rings. One of them answers, listens, and then turns to his coworker with a look of weary resignation. "The 80s called," he says. "They want their store back." And then the doors burst open. In pours a parade of 1980s icons: Hulk Hogan, Eric Estrada, Dee Snider from Twisted Sister, the robot from Short Circuit, Jason Voorhees, even Chucky. They ransack the place, carrying out boomboxes and cassette players and obsolete electronics while Loverboy's "Working for the Weekend" blasts on the soundtrack. The California Raisins dance past, a DeLorean idles outside. By the end, the store is empty, ready for transformation. The message was clear. RadioShack knew exactly what it had become: a museum, a punchline, a store so obviously stuck in the past that the only way forward was to burn it all down and start over. The commercial was a hit. People talked about it for days. Here was a company willing to laugh at itself, to acknowledge the elephant in the room, to promise something new. There was just one problem. Exactly 1 year and 3 days later, on February 5th, 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The transformation never came. The stores closed. The company that had once put a computer in every strip mall in America, that had sold the future to a generation of tinkerers and dreamers, was finished. The 80s had called, and RadioShack had nothing left to say. This is the story of how a company that genuinely invented the future forgot how to sell it. How a business that beat Apple in the personal computer wars ended up unable to survive the iPhone. How 94 years of American retail history collapsed in a slow-motion disaster that everyone saw coming and no one could stop. If you are old enough to remember walking into a RadioShack and buying resistors from those little plastic drawers, or begging your parents for a TRS-80, or getting your first cell phone from a guy in a red polo shirt who actually seemed to know what he was talking about, then this story is partly yours. And if you are too young for any of that, then this is the story of how the world you inherited got built, one soldering iron and one overpriced battery at a time. It begins, as so many American stories do, with two brothers and a dream. Boston, 1921, a small storefront, and a technology that was about to change everything. The name came from ships. On ocean-going vessels in the early 20th century, the radio equipment was typically housed in a small wooden structure on deck, separate from the main cabins. The sailors called it the Radio Shack. It was where you went to connect to the world beyond the horizon, to hear voices from across the water, to know that you were not alone. Theodore and Milton Deutschmann understood this. They were brothers, sons of German immigrants, and they had fallen in love with the new technology of wireless communication. In 1921, they opened a small retail and mail order operation at 46 Brattle Street in downtown Boston. They called it RadioShack. The name was a promise. This was the place where ordinary people could connect to the future. It was a good time to be in the radio business. Warren Harding was in the White House. The Roaring Twenties were just getting started. Prohibition was in full swing, which meant Americans were looking for entertainment they could enjoy at home. And radio was exploding. The first commercial radio station in America, KDKA in Pittsburgh, had launched just a year earlier. Suddenly, the airwaves were alive with voices and music and news, and anyone with the right equipment could pull those signals out of thin air. The Deutschmann brothers started by serving two kinds of customers. The first were radio officers on ships, professionals who needed reliable equipment and replacement parts. The second were amateur radio enthusiasts, the hobbyists who called themselves hams, and spent their evenings hunched over homemade receivers, trying to pick up signals from distant cities or, even other countries. These were the tinkerers, the experimenters, the people who wanted to understand how things worked and build things with their own hands. RadioShack supplied them with everything they needed: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, wire, antennas, and the specialized components that were nearly impossible to find anywhere else. The brothers published catalogs that became reference Bibles for the ham radio community. They built a reputation for knowing their products and knowing their customers. If you walked into RadioShack with a question, someone could answer it. By the late 1930s, RadioShack had become a significant player in the mail-order electronics business. They published their first major catalog in 1939 and expanded into the high-fidelity audio market, selling components for the growing number of Americans who wanted better sound from their record players. In 1947, they opened the nation's first dedicated audio showroom, a space where customers could compare speakers, amplifiers, turntables, and phonograph cartridges. It was retail as education, shopping as exploration. The company grew steadily through the post-war years. By the late 1950s, RadioShack had expanded to 9 stores, all clustered in the Northeast, and maintained a robust mail-order business that shipped components to hobbyists across the country. In 1959, they moved their headquarters to a larger building at 730 Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, across the street from Boston University's Marsh Chapel. They had ambitious plans for further expansion, but expansion cost money, and RadioShack, despite its loyal customer base and strong reputation, was not particularly well managed. By the early 1960s, the company was in serious trouble. A combination of overreach, mounting debt, and poor financial controls had pushed it to the edge of bankruptcy. The mail-order business that had been the company's backbone was hemorrhaging cash. The stores were struggling. The company had nearly $800,000 in uncollectible receivables, money owed by customers who would never pay. RadioShack needed a savior. And in 1962, one appeared from an unlikely place. Not from Boston or New York, not from the electronics industry at all, but from Fort Worth, Texas. From a man who had made his fortune selling leather to Boy Scouts. His name was Charles Tandy, and he was about to turn a dying hobby shop into an American institution. Charles David Tandy was born in Brownsville, Texas in 1918. His father, Dave Tandy, ran a leather supply company that sold materials to shoe repair shops across the Southwest. Young Charles grew up in the business, working the counter, learning to sell, absorbing the rhythms of retail. He was loud, gregarious, ambitious, and possessed of an almost supernatural confidence in his own instincts. After serving in the Navy Supply Corps during World War II, Tandy returned to Fort Worth with big ideas. He convinced his father to let him expand the leather business into hobby craft kits, pre-packaged sets of materials that let ordinary consumers make their own wallets, belts, and moccasins. It was a brilliant move. The kits sold like crazy, especially to Boy Scout troops and Girl Scout troops and summer camps. Tandy was tapping into something deep in the American psyche, the desire to make things with your own hands. By 1950, after a falling out with his father's original business partner, Charles and his father formed the independent Tandy Leather Company. Charles became president in 1955. Under his leadership, the company went public, expanded aggressively, and began acquiring other craft-related businesses. Tandy had a simple philosophy: find a hobby market, dominate it, and move on to the next one. In 1962, Tandy was looking for his next acquisition. His leather business was mature. He needed something with more growth potential. And then he heard about a struggling electronics retailer in Boston with 9 stores, a famous brand name, and nearly $1 million in bad debt. Charles Tandy bought RadioShack in 1963 for $300,000. It was pocket change for what he got. A nationally recognized brand, a mailing list of loyal hobbyists, and a foothold in the exploding consumer electronics market. But Tandy did not simply write a check and walk away. He understood that RadioShack's problems were structural. The company was trying to be too many things to too many people. The inventory was bloated with 40,000 different items. The mail order operation was slow and unprofitable. The management was unfocused. Tandy's solution was radical simplification. Within 2 years, he cut the product line from 40,000 items to roughly 2,500. He shut down the money-losing mail-order division entirely. He eliminated credit purchases, forcing customers to pay cash. He fired most of the top management, but kept the salespeople and merchandisers who actually understood the products. Then came the strategy that would define RadioShack for the next 3 decades. Tandy had 3 core principles, and he applied them with religious discipline. The first principle was private labels. Instead of stocking products from national brands and competing on price with every other retailer, Tandy would sell his own branded products, manufactured under exclusive contracts or eventually by Tandy's own factories. The brand names became familiar to a generation: Realistic for stereo equipment, Archer for antennas, Micronta for test equipment, Optimus for speakers. By controlling the supply chain, Tandy could maintain gross profit margins above 50%, numbers that traditional retailers could only dream about. The second principle was knowledgeable staff. Tandy insisted that every RadioShack store be staffed by people who actually understood electronics. This was not a place to work your way through college reading magazines behind the counter. Employees were expected to answer questions, solve problems, and help customers find what they needed. Store managers were required to take an ownership stake in their stores, giving them an incentive to work long hours and keep the location profitable. Tandy had a saying about his target customer: "We're not looking for the guy who wants to spend his entire paycheck on a sound system," he said. He wanted the customer who was looking to save money by buying cheaper goods and improving them through modifications and accessorizing. He was building stores for nerds, for tinkerers, for kids trying to win their science fairs, and he gave them employees who spoke their language. The third principle was advertising: massive, relentless, impossible to ignore advertising. "If you want to catch a mouse," Tandy liked to say, "you have to make a noise like a cheese." In the early years, as much as 9% of the company's gross profits went straight back into advertising. The newspaper ads and flyers were not subtle. Bold type, huge letters, screaming headlines about super sales. It was retail as spectacle, and it worked. The results were staggering. Within 2 years, RadioShack was profitable. By the end of the 1960s, Tandy Corporation's sales had grown to $180 million, driven primarily by the RadioShack expansion. The company was opening new stores at a pace that seemed almost reckless. 2 stores every working day by the early 1970s. Tandy used the customer data from the old mail order lists to decide where to open new locations. Every zip code that had produced orders got evaluated for a potential store. The stores were small, cheap to operate, and positioned in strip malls and neighborhood shopping centers where the target customers actually lived. By 1978, there were over 7,000 RadioShack locations across America. Charles Tandy himself remained surprisingly modest for a man running a retail empire. He stayed in his original office, answered his own phone, and kept his CB radio handle as Mr. Lucky. But luck had little to do with it. Tandy had seen something that others missed. There was an enormous appetite among ordinary Americans for affordable electronics and for the knowledge to use them. RadioShack became the store where that appetite was fed. And then, in the mid-1970s, something happened that would make Charles Tandy very rich indeed. The truckers got on the radio. If you were alive in 1975 and owned a television, you could not escape it. The music was everywhere. Convoy by C.W. McCall, a novelty country song about a group of rebel truckers using CB radios to evade the highway patrol, hit #1 on the Billboard charts in January 1976. The lyrics were packed with jargon that suddenly every American seemed to understand. Breaker 19, 10-4, good buddy. Smokey on your tail, what's your 20? The CB radio craze was not random. It had roots in a genuine crisis. When the Arab oil embargo hit in October 1973, America's energy infrastructure buckled. Gas stations ran dry. Lines stretched for blocks. The federal government responded by imposing a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour, a measure designed to conserve fuel but deeply unpopular with the truckers who made their living on the highways. The truckers already used CB radios to communicate with each other on long hauls. Now they began using them to organize. They shared information about which gas stations had fuel and which had run dry. They warned each other about speed traps. They coordinated protests and blockades. In December 1973, truckers used CB radio to organize a nationwide strike that shut down highways across the country. What started as a tool of blue-collar rebellion became a cultural phenomenon. Hollywood noticed. In 1977, Burt Reynolds starred in Smokey and the Bandit, a film about a bootlegger outrunning the law with the help of a CB-equipped truck convoy. The movie grossed over $300 million worldwide and made CB radios look impossibly cool. Suddenly, everyone wanted one. Suburban dads, teenagers, housewives. The First Lady of the United States, Betty Ford, had a CB handle. Even the cartoon character, Bugs Bunny, got into the act when Mel Blanc, his voice actor, would reportedly get on CB channels in character. For RadioShack, this was a license to print money. The company had been selling CB equipment for years to truckers and hobbyists, and now the entire country wanted in. RadioShack was one of the few retailers with the inventory, the supply chain, and the store footprint to meet the demand. They had CB radios on the shelves in 7,000 locations. They had employees who could explain the difference between models, help with antenna installations, and troubleshoot technical problems. The profits were extraordinary. Between 1973 and 1976, RadioShack's profits doubled. The CB radio fad was driving sales not just of radios, but of antennas, accessories, and related products. Customers who came in for a CB often left with a police scanner, a shortwave receiver, or a high-fidelity stereo system. The tide was lifting every boat in the store. But here is something worth remembering about fads. They end. The CB radio craze peaked in 1977, the same year the FCC expanded the available channels from 23 to 40. Ironically, this expansion helped kill the boom. Manufacturers had built massive inventories of 23-channel radios that were suddenly obsolete. The market was flooded with discounted equipment. And as more casual users crowded onto the airwaves, the culture that had made CB radio fun began to collapse under the weight of congestion, profanity, and interference. By 1979, the craze was over. The mainstream consumers moved on to the next thing, and RadioShack found itself with a problem. What would replace the CB radio as the engine of growth? The answer had already been sitting in a RadioShack store for 2 years. It was a beige box with a keyboard attached, a 12-inch monitor, and a cassette recorder for storage. It cost $599. It was called the TRS-80, and it was about to change everything. In 1976, a young product manager at RadioShack named Don French had an idea that his bosses thought was crazy. He wanted the company to sell a personal computer. At the time, personal computers barely existed as a consumer category. The MITS Altair, introduced in 1975, had sparked interest among hardcore hobbyists, but it came as a kit that required extensive assembly and offered almost no practical functionality out of the box. Apple Computer had incorporated in January 1977, but had not yet shipped the Apple II. The Commodore Pete was still a prototype. The idea that ordinary consumers would want to buy a computer and take it home was, to most observers, absurd. French was persistent. He convinced RadioShack management to let him hire an engineer to design a prototype. He found Steve Leininger, a 24-year-old who had been working at National Semiconductor and moonlighting at a computer store. Leininger was a member of the Homebrew Computer Club, the legendary gathering of Silicon Valley enthusiasts that had already produced Steve Wozniak and would shape the entire personal computer industry. The project was done on a shoestring. Total development cost was less than $150,000. The resulting machine used a Zilog Z80 processor, the cheapest high-performance microprocessor available at $25 per chip. It had 4 kilobytes of RAM, a full-stroke keyboard, and a ROM chip containing a basic programming language interpreter. Leininger and French called it the TRS-80 for Tandy RadioShack 80, the 80 referring to the Zilog Z80 chip at its heart. In February 1977, French and Leininger demonstrated their prototype to Charles Tandy himself. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, about what happened during that meeting. Tandy was asked to enter a salary figure into a simple tax accounting program they had written to show off the machine. He typed in $150,000, which happened to exceed the maximum value a 16-bit integer could store. The program crashed. It was not an auspicious beginning, but Tandy saw the potential. He approved production of 3,000 units, roughly one for each RadioShack store in America. The thinking was that if the computers did not sell, the stores could use them for inventory tracking and bookkeeping. It was a hedge, a way to limit the downside. On August 3, 1977, RadioShack held a press conference in New York City to announce the TRS-80. It was not a great day for press conferences. A terrorist bombing elsewhere in the city dominated the news. But 2 days later, at Boston University's Personal Computer Fair, the TRS-80 got the attention it deserved. The timing is worth noting. Stay with me here, because this is where the story gets remarkable. It was August 1977. Star Wars was still packing theaters across the country. Disco was at its peak. Elvis Presley was still alive, though he would be dead within 2 weeks. Saturday Night Fever would premiere in December and make John Travolta a star. America was on the cusp of something, though no one quite knew what. And RadioShack, a chain of hobby electronic stores run by a leather salesman from Fort Worth, had just introduced one of the first mass-market personal computers in history. The TRS-80 went on sale in September 1977 for $599 with a monitor and cassette recorder included. RadioShack's marketing proclaimed it the most important, useful, exciting electronic product of our time. Louis Kornfeld, RadioShack's president, declared that this device is inevitably in the future of everyone in the civilized world. Management expected to sell 3,000 units. They sold 10,000 in the first month and a half. By the end of the first year, 55,000 TRS-80s had been purchased. The demand was so intense that customers waited 2 months or more for delivery. One unit ended up in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. What made the TRS-80 successful was not technical superiority. The Apple II, which launched around the same time, was a better machine in many ways. But the TRS-80 had something Apple did not: distribution. RadioShack had over 3,000 stores across America. Even small towns had a RadioShack. You could walk in, see the computer in person, ask questions to a salesperson who understood the product, and walk out with a working machine the same day. Apple was selling through a handful of dealers and relying heavily on word of mouth. RadioShack was everywhere. Byte magazine later coined the term the 1977 Trinity to describe the three computers that launched the personal computing revolution: the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the TRS-80. Of the three, RadioShack sold the most units in the early years. By 1979, the TRS-80 had the largest software library of any personal computer on the market. By 1980, Tandy was supplying 3 times as many computers as Apple. The TRS-80 made RadioShack a technology company. It also made John Roach, the executive who had championed the computer internally, one of the most powerful figures in the organization. In 1980, Roach became president of the RadioShack division. In 1981, he became CEO of Tandy Corporation. Financial World magazine named him the best of the best and called Tandy the driving force at the front-running company in the red-hot personal computer race. But Charles Tandy did not live to see any of it. On November 4th, 1978, at age 60, he died of a heart attack. It was a few days before a new pope would be elected in Rome. The year had been one of endings. Remember this: the founder who built RadioShack into a retail empire was gone before the company's greatest technological triumph fully materialized. The private label strategy, the knowledgeable staff, the relentless advertising, all of it had been Charles Tandy's vision. What came next would be the work of other hands. Philip North, Tandy's longtime friend and administrative assistant, stepped in as interim CEO after Charles Tandy's death. By his own admission, North knew almost nothing about the technical side of the business. "All I know about electronics," he told Fortune magazine, "is that the funny end of the battery goes into the flashlight first. But North understood Tandy's management philosophy, and he kept the team together during the transition. The real power, increasingly, belonged to John Roach. Roach had joined Tandy in 1967 as a data processing manager. He had a degree in physics from Texas Christian University and a genuine understanding of what computers could become. He had championed the TRS-80 project from the beginning. Now, as CEO, he doubled down on the computer business. By 1982, Tandy had 500 dedicated RadioShack computer centers and as many as 900-plus stores, RadioShack locations with expanded computer sections. Computers accounted for 35% of the company's sales. In 1982, Financial World called Roach the driving force at the front-running company in the red-hot personal computer race. Tandy held nearly 40% of the personal computer market. The TRS-80 Model 100, a portable computer introduced in 1983, became the world's best-selling laptop. Microsoft's Bill Gates later called it his favorite computer of all time. But there was a problem, and it was built into the DNA of the company Charles Tandy had created. The private label strategy that had made RadioShack profitable was now a trap. Remember those Tandy exclusive brands? Realistic Archer, Micronta? They worked beautifully for stereos and antennas and test equipment, products where brand loyalty was weak and profit margins were everything. But computers were different. Computers needed software, and software developers were not going to write programs for a machine that could only be bought at RadioShack. The TRS-80 ran its own proprietary operating system and its own version of BASIC. It was not compatible with the machines from Apple or Commodore, or, most critically, from IBM. When IBM entered the personal computer market in August 1981 with the IBM PC, everything changed. IBM's decision to use an open architecture with off-the-shelf components and a freely licensable operating system from Microsoft created a standard that other manufacturers could clone. A vast ecosystem of software and hardware emerged around IBM compatibility. The TRS-80 was not part of that ecosystem, and users noticed. By 1984, RadioShack's market share had collapsed from nearly 40% to under 9%. Computer enthusiasts had a cruel nickname for the TRS-80, the Trash 80. The machine that had once beaten Apple was becoming a punchline. Roach understood the problem. In 1984, Tandy launched the Tandy 1000, the company's first fully IBM-compatible computer. The name change was deliberate. Serious business customers did not want to buy a computer with RadioShack on the case. The Tandy 1000 sold reasonably well, and for a few years in the mid-1980s, Tandy was the leading seller of IBM-compatible computers. But the company never regained its original dominance. The problem was structural. Tandy's competitive advantage had always been vertical integration, controlling the supply chain from manufacturing to retail. But in the IBM-compatible world, that advantage disappeared. Anyone could build a PC from commodity components. The margins collapsed. Price competition became brutal. By the early 1990s, Dell and Compaq and Gateway were eating Tandy's lunch. In 1993, Tandy threw in the towel. The company sold its computer manufacturing operations to AST Research and exited the PC business entirely. RadioShack stores would continue to sell computers, but they would be Compaq machines, not Tandy machines. The private label strategy that had built the company was officially dead, at least for computers. There is a melancholy irony here. A young man from California named Steve Wozniak had used parts from RadioShack in 1971 to build a Blue Box, a device that let him hack into AT&T's telephone network for free long-distance calls. His partner in that little scheme was Steve Jobs. 6 years later, Wozniak and Jobs founded Apple Computer. By 1993, Apple was still in business, adapting and evolving. RadioShack had sold the parts that helped build its own competition, and now it was retreating from the field. But the company was not done reinventing itself. There was one more transformation ahead, one more attempt to find a new identity. And for a while, it seemed to work. The cell phone era was about to begin. Leonard Roberts had a reputation as a turnaround artist. Before joining Tandy, he had led successful revivals at Arby's and Shoney's, two restaurant chains that had been struggling. In 1993, he became president of the RadioShack division. By 1997, he was running the entire company, and he had a plan. Roberts looked at RadioShack's 7,000 stores and saw not a liability, but an opportunity. The stores were small, cheap to operate, and located in every neighborhood in America. 94% of Americans, according to the company's own research, lived or worked within 5 minutes of a RadioShack. That kind of real estate footprint was valuable, if you could figure out what to sell. The answer, Roberts decided, was wireless phones. In 1997, RadioShack formed a partnership with Sprint. RadioShack stores would sell Sprint phones and service plans with dedicated Sprint communications stores, operating as kiosks within the larger RadioShack locations. It was one of the first store-within-a-store concepts in retail, and it worked. Customers who came in for batteries or cables discovered they could also sign up for a cell phone plan. The Sprint partnership brought traffic, commissions, and a sense that RadioShack was relevant again. Roberts reinforced the strategy with a new advertising campaign. "You've got questions, we've got answers." The slogan emphasized the knowledgeable staff that had always been RadioShack's calling card. Roberts instituted Saturday training sessions to ensure that employees actually understood the new technology. He expanded the repair business, allowing RadioShack technicians to fix products purchased elsewhere, betting that goodwill would generate future sales. The numbers looked good. By 1998, RadioShack was calling itself the single largest seller of consumer telecommunications products in the world. The stock price soared, reaching a peak of over $76 per share in late 1999. In May 2000, the company dropped the Tandy name entirely and became RadioShack Corporation. It was a bet that the future belonged to the stores, not to the legacy. At its peak in 1999, RadioShack operated more than 8,000 stores in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. The Tandy brand lived on in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Australia. It was, by any measure, one of the largest electronics retailers on the planet. If you watched The West Wing when it premiered that same year, you might remember a scene in the pilot episode where Toby Ziegler, the gruff communications director, is told he cannot use his cell phone on a plane because it interferes with navigation. "Are you telling me I can still flummox this thing?" he replies, "with something I bought at RadioShack?" It was a joke that only worked because everyone in America knew what RadioShack was. The stores had become part of the cultural furniture. And in the Netflix series Stranger Things, set in 1984 but released in 2016, a character named Bob Newby works as the manager of the Hawkins, Indiana RadioShack. He calls himself Bob the Brain because at RadioShack, he is the smartest guy in the room. An Armatron robotic arm sits on the shelf behind him, a real product from that era. It is a portrait of RadioShack as a sanctuary for a certain kind of person, the tinkerer, the enthusiast, the guy who knows things. But here's the thing about the wireless strategy that Roberts championed. It worked too well. By the early 2000s, cell phones accounted for roughly 50% of RadioShack's total sales. The company had bet its future on a single product category, and that category was about to be transformed in ways that RadioShack could not survive. I am not entirely certain of the exact percentage at its peak, but multiple sources put cell phone sales at somewhere between 40 and 50% of total revenue by the mid-2000s. The point is that RadioShack had become, effectively, a cell phone store that happened to sell some other stuff. And when the cell phone business changed, RadioShack had nowhere to hide. In 2005, RadioShack reported peak revenue of approximately $5 billion. It seemed like vindication for the wireless strategy. But the profit picture told a different story. Net income was declining even as sales held steady. The margins on cell phones were thin and getting thinner. And the competitive environment was about to become brutal. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. "Every once in a while," he said, "a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." He was right. The iPhone did not just change the phone business, it changed retail. Before the iPhone, customers bought phones from retailers like RadioShack because they needed someone to explain the features, help them choose between models, and set up their service plans. After the iPhone, the phone became the brand. Customers wanted iPhones specifically. They went to Apple stores to get them, or they went to AT&T stores, or they ordered online. RadioShack was just another middleman, and middlemen were becoming irrelevant. The problem extended beyond Apple. The entire wireless carrier landscape was consolidating. AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint all opened their own retail stores, staffed by their own employees, offering their own exclusive deals. Why would a customer go to RadioShack for a Sprint phone when they could go to a Sprint store? RadioShack had no exclusive products, no leverage, no reason to exist except inertia. At the same time, Amazon was eating the rest of the business. The batteries, the cables, the adapters, the components, everything that RadioShack had sold for decades was now available online with free shipping and lower prices. The very ubiquity that had once been RadioShack's strength, a store in every neighborhood, became a liability. Each location was a fixed cost, burning through rent and payroll, whether customers came or not. The leadership chaos did not help. Between 2005 and 2014, RadioShack burned through 7 different CEOs. In 2006, CEO David Edmondson resigned after it was revealed he had misstated his academic credentials on his resume. His successor, Claire Bobrowski, came from McDonald's. She was followed by Julian Day, a turnaround specialist from Kmart known for aggressive cost-cutting. Day was followed by Jim Gooch, then Dorvin Lively, then finally Joe Manaka, a former Walgreens executive who arrived in 2013 with ambitious plans for a reinvention. The revolving door at the top created whiplash throughout the organization. Strategies were started and abandoned. Initiatives were launched and forgotten. The employees who had once been RadioShack's greatest asset, the knowledgeable staff who could answer questions and solve problems, were ground down by uncertainty and cost cuts. In 2004, thousands of managers filed a class action lawsuit alleging wage theft and abusive working conditions. In 2006, the company laid off 400 employees via mass email. The culture that Charles Tandy had built was rotting from within. In 2012, RadioShack's credit rating was downgraded to junk status. The company was hemorrhaging cash. Desperate for financing, management struck a deal that would prove fatal. They secured a $250 million line of credit from Salus Capital. The terms included a provision that RadioShack could not close more than 200 stores per year without Salus's permission. Think about what this meant. RadioShack had over 4,000 stores. Many of them were unprofitable. The only way to stop the bleeding was to close locations and reduce costs. But the Salus deal prevented them from closing locations fast enough to make a difference. They were contractually obligated to keep losing money. By early 2015, RadioShack had reported 11 consecutive quarterly losses. The company was burning through cash so fast, it could not even afford the severance payments and lease termination fees required to close its worst stores. In January, the Wall Street Journal reported that RadioShack had stopped paying rent to some landlords and was preparing a bankruptcy filing. On February 2nd, the company was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange after its market capitalization fell below $50 million. On February 5th, 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Exactly 1 year and 3 days after that Super Bowl commercial where the 80s came to take their store back, the store was gone. The company published a list of over 1,700 stores slated for immediate closure. Employees received little notice. Some learned their stores were closing via text message. Customers who held RadioShack gift cards found them worthless until legal pressure from state attorneys general forced the company to honor them. And then there was the data. RadioShack had spent decades collecting customer information, name, address, phone number, purchase history. The company's privacy policy had always promised that this data would never be sold. During the bankruptcy proceedings, RadioShack included those 67 million customer records as an asset for sale. It was a final betrayal, a company selling the trust its customers had placed in it. A hedge fund called Standard General purchased RadioShack's assets for $26.2 million. They partnered with Sprint to operate about 1,700 co-branded stores. It was supposed to be a lifeline. It was not. 2 years later, in March 2017, RadioShack filed for bankruptcy again. This time, almost all the remaining stores closed. The brand was sold, and then sold again, and again. The RadioShack story could end here, with the second bankruptcy and the liquidation. But brands, like ghosts, do not always stay dead. In 2020, a company called Retail E-commerce Ventures acquired the RadioShack brand. Their strategy was to buy distressed retail names, Pier 1, Models, Dress Barn, and revive them as e-commerce operations. RadioShack would become, primarily, a website. A few hundred independently owned franchise stores would continue to operate. But the chain, as Americans had known, it was finished. Then came the cryptocurrency pivot. In 2022, RadioShack's social media accounts began posting content that can only be described as deeply strange. Profane tweets, crude jokes, attempts to generate attention for something called RadioShack Swap, a cryptocurrency trading platform. The strategy, such as it was, generated headlines but also confusion and revulsion. Hobbytown USA, which had been partnering with RadioShack to sell components through their stores, terminated the relationship. The brand that had once stood for knowledgeable service was now associated with shock value marketing. In May 2023, Unicomer Group, an El Salvador-based retail and consumer finance company, acquired RadioShack's intellectual property and domain rights in approximately 70 countries. They plan to operate the brand through over 2,000 points of sale globally. Whether this represents a genuine revival or simply another way station in the brand's long decline remains to be seen. But let us step back from the corporate maneuvering and ask a different question. What was RadioShack really? What did it mean? For those of you who never walked into one during its heyday, let me try to explain. A RadioShack was a small store, usually in a strip mall or a neighborhood shopping center, filled with products that most people did not quite understand. There were wall mounts of little plastic drawers containing resistors, capacitors, and transistors. There were racks of wire and solder and heat shrink tubing. There were headphones and speakers and calculators and remote control cars. There were batteries, always batteries, in every size imaginable. And there was a man or woman behind the counter who actually knew what they were talking about. If you came in with a project, they could help you find the parts. If something was broken, they might know how to fix it. If you were a kid trying to build something for your science fair, they would take you seriously. That last part mattered more than you might think. RadioShack was where a certain kind of child discovered that they could make things, could understand how things worked, could participate in technology, not just consume it. The Science Fair 150-in-1 electronic project kits taught a generation to solder and read schematics. The TRS-80 taught a generation to program in BASIC. The store was a gateway, a portal into a world of building and creating. The maker movement that emerged in the 2000s, the Arduino boards and Raspberry Pi computers and 3D printers, the hacker spaces and fab labs and DIY culture, all of it traces back, in some sense, to those little stores in the strip malls. The makers are the spiritual descendants of the ham radio operators the Deutschmann brothers served a century ago. They are the tinkerers Charles Tandy built his empire to reach. And RadioShack missed them. That is perhaps the cruelest irony of all. During the 2010s, as the maker movement exploded, and Adafruit and SparkFun and DigiKey built thriving businesses selling components to hobbyists, RadioShack was focused on cell phones. The company that had once been the tinkerer's candy store had abandoned its core constituency for a business it could not win. In 2013, RadioShack did try to reconnect. They formed a partnership with Make Magazine and began stocking Arduino boards and basic components. But it was too little, too late. The stores were already dying. The knowledgeable staff had been cut. The soul was gone. So, here is what we are left with. A brand that still exists, sort of, as a website and a scattering of franchise stores. A legacy of products that shaped entire industries. A cautionary tale about what happens when a company forgets what made it special. Radio Shack invented the future repeatedly. The ham radio shop, the CB radio superstore, the personal computer pioneer. Each time, they saw what was coming and got there first. And each time, they eventually lost their way. The private labels that built the profits became the proprietary trap that killed the computers. The ubiquitous stores that made them accessible became the fixed costs that bled them dry. The cell phone strategy that revived them made them dependent on partners who would eventually abandon them. I never got to work at a Radio Shack, though I spent plenty of time in them as a kid, buying parts for projects I barely understood. There was something magical about those stores, something that made you feel like the future was accessible if you just knew where to look. The guy in the red polo shirt might point you to exactly the component you needed, or he might not know anything at all, depending on the store and the era. But the promise was always there. This is a place where people who make things come to get what they need. That promise is now being fulfilled elsewhere, online mostly, by companies that the people behind those Radio Shack counters might have loved. The tinkerers found new sources for their parts. The makers built new communities. The future did not need Radio Shack to arrive, but something was lost when those stores closed. A physical space where curiosity was welcome. A place where you could walk in not knowing what you needed and walk out with exactly that thing. A shack in the original sense, where you went to connect to something larger than yourself. The 80s Called. Radio Shack had nothing left to give them, and the rest of us are left with the catalogs, the memories, and the question of what comes next, for a world that no longer has a Radio Shack on every corner.